The scream tore through the castle halls before dawn even touched the windows. Alira Voss froze at the top of the servants' staircase, her basket of folded linens nearly slipping from her arms. Somewhere above her, wood cracked. Stone shifted. A low, rolling growl rumbled through the corridor, like distant thunder trapped inside the walls. She had been in Thornwood Castle for exactly 4 days, and in those 4 days, she had already learned one unbreakable rule. Never go near the east wing before sunrise. Never knock on the king's door without being summoned. And never, under any circumstance, look him directly in the eyes. But the sound she heard now was not the sound of a man simply angry. It was the sound of something breaking apart from the inside. She should have turned around. Every servant she had spoken to in her short time here had warned her, in hushed voices, about King Ronan Blackthorn. They called him the Alpha King who ruled without mercy, the man whose wolf had not shown its true face to anyone in years, not since the night his mate had been murdered in front of him. They said his temper could shatter glass. They said grown warriors trembled at the sound of his footsteps. They said the last maid who entered his study without permission had been dismissed from the castle within the hour, sent away with nothing but the clothes on her back. Alira set the basket down slowly and continued up the stairs anyway. She told herself it was because she had a duty to check that no one was hurt. That was not entirely a lie, but there was something else pulling her forward too, something she could not name, a strange steadiness in her chest, even as her hands trembled slightly around the folds of her apron. She had never been a fearful person, not even as a child, not even after everything her family had lost. Fear was a luxury she had learned to set aside a long time ago. The door to the king's private study stood ajar at the end of the hallway, a thin blade of firelight spilling out across the stone floor. Alira paused just outside it, listening. Inside, furniture scraped against wood. A low snarl vibrated through the air, deep and inhuman, the kind of sound that belonged in the throat of a beast rather than a man. She pushed the door open. The study was in ruins. Books had been swept from their shelves in violent arcs, their pages fanned open across the floor like broken wings. A wooden chair lay splintered near the fireplace, and there, crouched near the tall window with his back to her, was King Ronan Blackthorn, his shoulders heaving, his hands pressed flat against the stone sill hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. He was shifting. Not fully, not into the wolf that legend spoke of, but enough that Alira could see the change rippling beneath his skin, the way his shoulders had broadened unnaturally, the way dark fur seemed to flicker along his forearms before receding again, as if his body could not decide which shape it wanted to hold. His breathing came in ragged pulls, each one sounding like it cost him enormous effort. Every instinct told her to run. Every story she had heard in the servants' quarters told her that this was the exact scenario they had all warned her about. A half-shifted alpha, lost somewhere between man and wolf, dangerous in ways that ordinary people could not survive. Alira did not run. She noticed, instead, that the fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, and the room had gone cold. She noticed the tray of food on the side table, untouched, the tea long gone cold in its cup. She noticed, with a strange and sudden clarity, that whatever was happening to this man had less to do with rage and more to do with grief that had nowhere left to go. Quietly, she crossed the room and knelt down to gather the fallen books from the floor. The growling stopped. She felt his attention shift toward her like a physical weight, felt the air in the room change, grow taut and dangerous. She did not look up. She simply continued stacking the books, straightening their spines, setting them gently back onto the lowest shelf within her reach. "Who told you that you could enter this room?" His voice was low, rough, scraped raw from the strain of holding his own body together. It was not truly a question. It was a warning, wrapped in the shape of one. "No one told me," Alira said, still not looking up. "I heard a noise. I came to see if someone needed help. Do you understand what I am?" "I understand you are the king," she answered simply, "and I understand something is hurting you tonight." The silence that followed felt endless. She continued arranging the books, her hands steady despite the thundering of her own heart, which she refused to let show on her face. When she finally rose and turned toward the fireplace to add fresh wood to the dying embers, she allowed herself a single glance in his direction. He had turned to face her fully now, and what she saw took the breath from her lungs, though she did not let it show. His eyes had gone gold, the pupils narrow and sharp. Wolf eyes set into a human face, still fighting to remain human. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle ticked beneath his skin. He looked less like a king in that moment, and more like a man standing at the very edge of himself, one push away from falling into something he might never climb back out of. And yet, he had not moved toward her. He had not raised his voice again. He simply watched her with those unnatural golden eyes, as she knelt by the hearth and coaxed the fire back to life, feeding it kindling, until warm light began to fill the room once more. "You are not afraid," he said finally, and this time, there was something different beneath the roughness of his voice. Not quite confusion, something closer to disbelief. "I did not say that," Illyra replied, glancing at him again. "I only said, I understand you are the king." Something flickered across his expression, so brief she almost missed it. It was not quite a smile. It was something more startled than that, as if she had said something no one had said to him in a very long time. He watched her for a moment longer, his golden eyes tracking the careful, unhurried way she moved through the wreckage of his study, and something in his chest, long dormant, seemed to shift uneasily beneath the weight of her presence. He had grown accustomed over the past 6 years to servants who moved through his chambers as quickly and quietly as possible, eager to finish their duties and escape before his temper could turn toward them. This girl moved as though she had nowhere else she needed to be, as though tidying a shattered study in the middle of the night were simply another ordinary task, no different from folding linens or polishing silver. "Most people run," he said quietly, almost to himself. Illyra paused in her work, glancing toward him with an expression that held no judgment, only quiet curiosity. "Should I be running, my lord?" "Every instinct in this castle would tell you that you should." "Then perhaps I have simply learned not to trust every instinct that fear tries to hand me," she replied, returning to her task. "Fear is not always a reliable guide. Sometimes it only tells us what everyone else has already decided to believe, rather than what is actually true." Ronan said nothing further, though he continued to watch her long after the words had settled into the quiet room, something unfamiliar stirring behind his storm-gray eyes, a question he did not yet know how to voice, even to himself. The fire caught fully now, casting a warm orange glow across the wreckage of the study. Illyra rose to her feet and picked up the tray of untouched food, glancing at the cold tea with a small frown. "This has been sitting here for hours," she said. "You should not skip meals like this. It will not help whatever is troubling you." She was aware, even as the words left her mouth, that she had just lectured the Alpha King of Thornwood Pack, as though he were an ordinary man who had forgotten to eat his supper. She half expected him to raise his voice at her, to demand her name so he could have her dismissed before the sun rose. Instead, he simply stared at her, the gold in his eyes beginning to recede, replaced slowly by the deep, storm gray she would later learn was his natural color. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. "Illyra Voss, my lord." "Illyra Voss," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it in his mouth. "You should leave now." It was not unkind, the way he said it. It sounded almost like a plea disguised as an order, as though he were trying to protect her from something he did not fully understand himself. Illyra nodded once, gathered the tray, and walked toward the door. Just before she stepped out into the hallway, she paused. "I will bring fresh tea in the morning, my lord. And something warm to eat. You should not go through the night with nothing in you." She did not wait for his answer. She simply left, closing the door softly behind her, and made her way back down the servants' staircase, with her heart pounding harder than she would ever admit to anyone. By the time she reached the kitchens, the first gray light of dawn had begun creeping through the narrow windows. The head cook, a stout, sharp-eyed woman named Marta, glanced up from her work and went pale at the sight of her. "You went up to the east wing," Marta said, not as a question. "I heard a noise," Illyra said simply, setting the tray down. "Someone needed help." "Girl, do you have any idea what could have happened to you?" Marta's voice dropped to a fierce whisper, glancing nervously toward the doorway, as though the walls themselves might report back to the king. "No one goes near him when he is like that, no one. The last few servants who tried to check on him during one of his fits were sent away before the week was out, and that was the kindest outcome anyone dared to hope for." "He did not send me away," Illyra said quietly. Marta's sharp eyes studied her for a long moment. something unreadable crossing her weathered face. Then you are either the luckiest girl in this castle, or the most stubborn one. Perhaps both. Alira said nothing more on the matter, choosing instead to busy herself with the morning's work, though her mind kept drifting back to the golden eyes that had watched her so intently, to the strange, aching quiet that had settled over the king once the fire had been lit again. She thought of the untouched tea, the broken chair, the way his voice had softened, however slightly, when he told her to leave. She thought, too, of her own life before Thornwood, of the small village she had come from, scattered by hardships that were not truly her own, of the family she no longer had, of the long road that had led her here, with nothing but a letter of recommendation, and a stubborn refusal to be afraid of things that frightened everyone else. Perhaps that was why she had not run. She had already lost the things most people spent their whole lives fearing to lose. There was very little left in her that fear could still reach. Later that morning, as she carried a tray of tea and warm bread up toward the east wing, exactly as she had promised, one of the castle guards stepped into her path, his expression tight with concern. "You should not go up there again," he said. "Whatever happened last night, do not push your luck a second time." "I made a promise," Alira said simply, and stepped around him. The guard did not stop her again, though she felt his worried eyes on her back the entire length of the corridor. When she reached the study door, she knocked softly, twice, and waited. There was a long pause before the door opened, just a few inches, revealing one storm-gray eye and the sharp line of a jaw that looked as though it had not fully relaxed even now, hours after the fire had calmed him. "I told you to leave," Ronan said, though there was none of the earlier warning in his tone.
"You did,"
Alira agreed, lifting the tray slightly. "And I told you I would bring breakfast. I do not break promises, my lord." For a long moment, he simply looked at her, as though trying to solve some puzzle written across her face. Then, without another word, he opened the door wider and stepped aside to let her in. Neither of them could have known, in that quiet gray morning, that something ancient and long buried had just stirred awake inside him, something that had been silent since the night he lost everything. Neither of them could have known that the maid who dared to walk toward danger instead of away from it had just taken the very first step toward a bond that would shake the foundations of an entire kingdom. But deep within him, beneath the exhaustion and the grief, and the walls he had spent years building around his heart, something ancient stirred. Something that had been silent for a very long time opened one careful eye and turned its attention toward the quiet, steady girl, standing in his doorway, with a tray of warm bread and no fear in her hands at all. The days that followed felt strange to Alira, as though she were walking through a version of the castle no one else could see. She continued her morning visits to the king's study, always with tea, always with something warm to eat, and though he never once thanked her aloud, she noticed that the tray was always empty by the time she came to collect it. She noticed, too, that the study stopped being destroyed in the early hours. The chairs remained whole, the books stayed on their shelves. Whatever storm had been raging inside him seemed, for the moment, to have quieted. She did not tell herself it was because of her. That felt too large a thought to hold, too dangerous to believe. She told herself instead that perhaps he had simply been having a difficult week, and that anyone would calm eventually, king or otherwise. It was easier that way, to keep the strange flutter in her chest tucked safely out of sight, unexamined, unnamed. But on the fifth morning, when she arrived with the tray and found him already awake, seated at his desk with a stack of papers before him instead of pacing the floor like a caged animal, he looked up at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not warmth exactly. It was closer to curiosity, the way a man might look at a puzzle he had given up solving long ago, only to find one final piece had appeared where he least expected it. "You are the first person in this castle who does not flinch when I look at you," he said. Alira set the tray down carefully, meeting his gaze without hesitation, though her heart beat a strange, unfamiliar rhythm beneath her ribs. "Perhaps they have not looked closely enough, my lord." Ronan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in something far more dangerous to a man who had spent years guarding every part of himself. Interest. Neither of them spoke of it again that morning, but something had shifted between them, quietly, the way the first crack forms in ice, long before anyone hears it break. 2 weeks passed, and Alira Voss found herself no longer simply visiting the king's study. She had been formally reassigned, without explanation, to manage his private chambers directly, a posting that made every other servant in the castle look at her, with a mixture of pity and disbelief. The steward who delivered the news, a thin, nervous man named Peter, had practically whispered the assignment to her, as though speaking too loudly might undo it. "No maid has held that post longer than a month in 3 years, Peter told her, wringing his hands. The last one left in tears. The one before that asked to be transferred to the stables rather than face him again. "I understand," Alira said simply, and went to gather her things. She did not tell Peter, or anyone else, that she had begun to notice things about the king that no one else seemed to see. She noticed that his temper, so infamous throughout the castle, only ever flared when he was tired, when he had gone too many hours without sleep, or too many days without a proper meal. She noticed that his sharp words to the guards and advisors were sharpest on the anniversaries of dates he never spoke aloud, dates she guessed, with a quiet ache in her chest, must be connected to the mate he had lost. She noticed that beneath the crown and the title, and the fear that surrounded him like armor, there was simply a man who had been alone for a very long time, and had forgotten what it felt like not to be. Her new duties kept her close to him, in ways her old position never had. She managed his chambers, ensured his meals arrived on time whether he asked for them or not, kept the fire in his hearth burning through the cold mountain nights, and organized the endless stream of correspondence that piled up on his desk when he refused to deal with it himself. It was tedious work by most standards, the kind of thankless labor that wore down even the most patient of servants. Alira did not find it tedious at all. She found, instead, a strange satisfaction in watching small things change around her, in noticing the way his shoulders relaxed slightly when he stepped into a warm room instead of a cold one, in seeing the way he began, almost without realizing it, to eat the meals she brought instead of letting them grow cold and untouched. She began leaving small things for him that went beyond her required duties. A second blanket folded at the foot of his bed for the colder nights. A handwritten note tucked beside his morning correspondence, reminding him of meetings he was prone to forget when his mind grew too heavy with old grief. A cup of tea brewed the exact way she had noticed he preferred it, strong and unsweetened, left steaming on his desk before he even had to ask. He never thanked her for any of it, not directly. But she noticed the blanket was always used by morning, the notes always read and acted upon, the tea always finished down to the last drop. It became, without either of them naming it as such, a quiet language between them, built entirely of small gestures and careful silences. One evening, nearly 3 weeks into her new position, she found him standing at the tall window of his chambers, long after the sun had set, staring out at the dark mountains beyond the castle walls, with an expression so distant, it frightened her more than any half-shifted rage ever could. "My lord," she said softly, setting down the tray she carried, "your supper is here." He did not turn. "Leave it. I am not hungry." Alira hesitated only a moment before crossing the room to stand a respectful distance beside him, following his gaze out toward the mountains. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unbroken, until she finally spoke, her voice careful. "You are thinking of her tonight." It was not a question, and she was not entirely certain what had given her the courage to say it aloud. Ronan's jaw tightened, and for a moment she feared she had overstepped in a way that could not be undone. But when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "Her name was Celine," he said. "She was my mate. My wolf chose her the moment we met, when I was barely more than a boy learning to carry the weight of this crown. We were happy, for a time, happier than I ever believed I deserved to be." Alira said nothing, sensing that any interruption might close the door he had just, however slightly, opened. "She was killed 6 years ago," he continued, his voice flat, controlled in the way that spoke of pain pressed down so hard it had nowhere left to go but stillness. "Rival pack members, seeking to weaken Thornwood before a territory dispute. They knew that killing her would break something in me that no army ever could. They were not wrong. I am sorry," Alira said quietly, and meant it with her whole heart. "Everyone is sorry," Ronan said, something bitter creeping into his tone now. "Sorry does not undo 6 years of silence. It does not undo a wolf that has refused to fully surface since the night I found her body in the training yard, cold before I could even reach her. Sorry does not fix what is broken in me, Alira Voss. It was the first time he had said her full name since that first morning in his study, and something about hearing it in his voice, rough with old grief, made her chest ache in a way she did not fully understand. Perhaps it does not need fixing, she said carefully. Perhaps it only needs someone willing to sit beside it, without asking it to be anything other than what it is. Ronan turned to look at her then, truly look at her. His storm-gray eyes searching her face, as though trying to determine whether she meant the words she had spoken, or whether they were simply the practiced comfort of a servant, trained to soothe a difficult master. Whatever he found in her expression seemed to satisfy him, because the tension in his shoulders eased, just slightly, and he turned back toward the window. You are unlike anyone else in this castle, he said quietly. Perhaps I have simply learned that fear does not fix broken things either, Alira replied. It only keeps people from getting close enough to help mend them. They stood together in silence after that, watching the dark shapes of the mountains beneath a sky scattered with distant stars, and though neither of them spoke another word that evening, something had shifted between them again, deeper this time, a crack in the ice widening just enough to let a sliver of warmth through. From that night forward, their quiet routine deepened into something neither of them dared to name aloud. Alira found herself lingering longer in his chambers than her duties strictly required, and Ronan, for his part, found reasons to keep her there, asking questions about her days, about the small kingdom she had come from before Thornwood, about the family she rarely spoke of to anyone else. She told him, in careful pieces over several evenings, about the raids that had scattered her village when she was young, about losing her parents to circumstances she still found difficult to speak of in full, about the years she had spent moving from post to post, never quite belonging anywhere long enough to call it home. And yet you are not afraid of anything, Ronan observed one evening, watching her arrange fresh linens across his bed with practiced efficiency. Not even a king with a temper capable of shattering stone. I did not say I am not afraid, Alira replied, echoing words she had spoken to him weeks before. I said I understand loss well enough to recognize it in someone else. That understanding does not leave much room left for fear. Ronan considered this for a long moment, something thoughtful crossing his sharp features. Most people who understand loss choose to protect themselves from more of it. They build walls, keep their distance, guard what little peace they have left. Perhaps, Alira said, meeting his gaze steadily. But walls only protect you from being hurt again, my lord. They do not protect you from being alone. I have found, in my own life, that loneliness can hurt just as much as loss, if you let it linger long enough. Something flickered in his storm-gray eyes at that, something raw and unguarded, that he quickly masked behind the practiced neutrality he wore like a second skin. He did not respond, but later that night, long after she had returned to her small room in the servants' quarters, Alira lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment again and again, wondering at the strange warmth that had settled beneath her ribs and refused to fade. The following morning brought an unexpected shift in their routine. Ronan requested, through a note delivered by one of the younger pages, that Alira accompany him on his usual inspection of the castle's outer walls, a task he normally completed alone or with a small escort of guards. She arrived at the appointed hour to find him already waiting near the stables, dressed in simple traveling clothes rather than the formal attire he typically wore within the castle, looking, for the first time since she had known him, almost like an ordinary man, rather than a king carrying the weight of an entire pack upon his shoulders. You do not have to come, he said, though something in his tone suggested he hoped she would anyway. I only thought you might appreciate seeing more of the territory you now call home. They rode together, along the frost-hardened paths that wound around Thornwood's outer boundaries, and Alira found herself surprised by how easily conversation flowed between them, once removed from the formal weight of the castle's stone corridors. Ronan spoke, hesitantly at first, of his own childhood, of the years spent training beneath his father's watchful eye, of the responsibilities that had settled onto his shoulders far earlier than most young alphas typically bore them. Alira listened, offering her own careful observations in return, and by the time they returned to the castle stables as the sun began sinking toward the western mountains, something had settled between them that neither of them quite dared to name, though both felt its presence clearly enough. Thank you, Ronan said quietly. helping her down from her horse with a gentleness that lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary. For today, I cannot recall the last time I rode those paths without the weight of duty pressing down on every mile. Perhaps duty and peace are not always opposites, my lord, Alira replied. Perhaps sometimes they simply need the right company to exist together. Ronan's hand remained at her waist a moment longer than propriety strictly demanded, and though neither of them spoke of it, the warmth of that lingering touch stayed with Alira long after she had returned to her duties that evening, a small, quiet secret she carried carefully against her chest, like something precious not yet ready to be shared. She did not yet understand what was happening between them. She did not yet know about mates, about the ancient bond that could form between a wolf and the one soul capable of calming the storm inside them. She only knew that something had changed within her these past weeks, something quiet and steady and impossible to ignore, and that every morning she found herself eager to climb the stairs toward the east wing, toward a man the whole castle feared, and toward the small, unguarded moments he seemed to save only for her. What she could not have known, as she drifted finally into an uneasy sleep, was that far below the castle, in the shadowed corners of the great hall, eyes had already begun to notice the change in their king, eyes that did not welcome it, eyes that had spent years waiting for their own chance to claim the throne beside him, and had no intention of letting a quiet, unremarkable maid stand in their way. The great hall of Thornwood Castle had never felt smaller to Alira than it did on the morning of the Pack Council meeting. She had been sent to deliver a forgotten set of documents to the king, nothing more, a simple errand that should have taken only a few minutes. She had not expected to walk into a room already thick with tension, the air heavy enough to press against her skin like a physical weight. Around the long stone table sat the highest-ranking members of Thornwood Pack, a dozen sharp-faced men and women whose eyes missed nothing. At the head of the table stood Ronan, his hands braced against the wood, his shoulders rigid with a fury Alira had not seen in him since that first terrible morning in his study weeks ago. Across from him stood a broad-shouldered warrior named Garrick, second in command of the Pack's border forces, his voice raised in open challenge. "3 of our scouts are missing along the northern ridge," Garrick was saying, his tone sharp with barely restrained accusation. "And you have done nothing but sit in this castle, brooding over papers, while our people vanish into the forest. Perhaps if you spent less time locked away with your grief, and more time leading this pack, we would not be losing our own to whoever is testing our borders." The silence that followed felt like the moment before a lightning strike. Alira, still standing near the doorway, with the forgotten documents clutched in her hands, watched as something dangerous rippled through Ronan's frame. His eyes, still the storm gray she had grown so used to seeing, began to bleed slowly toward gold, the way they had that first night in his study. The way she now understood meant his wolf was rising dangerously close to the surface. "You forget yourself, Garrick," Ronan said, his voice dropping into a register that seemed to vibrate through the stone floor itself. "Do I?" Garrick pressed, either too proud or too foolish to recognize the danger radiating from the man across the table. "Or have you forgotten yourself, locked away in mourning for a mate 6 years gone, while the living suffer for your absence?" The words landed like a physical blow. Alira watched Ronan's hands curl into fists against the table, watched the muscles along his jaw tighten to the point of visible strain, watched the gold in his eyes deepen further, the pupils narrowing into something far more wolf than man. The other council members shifted uneasily in their seats, several of them instinctively lowering their gazes, none of them daring to intervene in a confrontation between an alpha losing control and a warrior who had just crossed a line that could not easily be uncrossed. Alira felt it before she understood why. A pull, sudden and undeniable, drawing her forward across the hall, as though some invisible thread had tightened between her chest and his. She did not decide to move. Her feet simply carried her, past the startled glances of the council members, until she stood close enough to Ronan's side that she could feel the heat radiating off him, could hear the low, dangerous rumble building in his chest that was no longer entirely human. "My lord," she said quietly, setting the documents down on the table beside him, "these require your signature before midday." It was, on its surface, an absurd interruption, a servant discussing paperwork in the middle of a confrontation that threatened to end in bloodshed. But something in her steady voice, in the calm, unhurried way she stood beside him without a trace of fear, seemed to cut through the rising tide of his fury like a blade through fog. Ronan's head turned toward her, and for one long, suspended moment, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. The gold in his eyes did not vanish, not entirely, but it steadied, the wildness in it settling into something more controlled, more grounded. His shoulders, which had been coiled tight enough to shatter, loosened by careful degrees. Illyra held his gaze without flinching, without looking away, offering him nothing but the same quiet steadiness she had offered him every morning for weeks now. "Thank you, Illyra," he said finally, his voice rough but no longer edged with the dangerous vibration of moments before. "Leave them. I will see to it shortly." She nodded once and stepped back, though she did not immediately leave the hall, some instinct telling her it was not yet safe to do so. Around the table, the council members exchanged glances, heavy with unspoken questions, none of them quite able to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Garrick, for his part, stared at Illyra with narrowed, calculating eyes, clearly recognizing that something significant had just occurred, even if he did not yet understand what it was. "Council is dismissed," Ronan said, his voice steady now, carrying the full weight of his authority once more. "Garrick, you and I will speak further on the missing scouts, alone." The others filed out quickly, relief evident on more than one face, as they escaped the tension that had gripped the hall only moments before. Illyra turned to leave as well, but Ronan's voice stopped her before she had taken more than a few steps. "Stay," he said, and there was something in the single word that made her chest tighten with an emotion she could not quite name. She stayed near the doorway, as Garrick and Ronan spoke in low, controlled tones about border patrols and missing scouts, matters of pack security that meant little to her, beyond the obvious concern etched into both men's faces. But she noticed, throughout the exchange, that Ronan's gaze kept flickering toward her, brief and almost involuntary, as though some part of him needed to confirm she was still there, still steady, still unafraid. When Garrick finally left, casting one last unreadable glance in Illyra's direction before disappearing through the heavy doors, Ronan sank into the chair at the head of the table, exhaustion settling visibly over his features, now that the immediate danger had passed. "That has never happened before," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "What has not, my lord?" "My wolf." He rubbed a hand across his face, something almost bewildered in his expression. "It has not responded to another person's presence like that in 6 years. Not since Celine. It rises for confrontation, for danger, for grief. It does not calm for anyone." Illyra felt her heart stumble slightly in her chest, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "Perhaps it simply recognized a familiar voice, my lord. We have spent many mornings together these past weeks." Ronan looked at her then, a long, searching look that made her feel as though he could see straight through the careful walls she had built around her own uncertain feelings. "Perhaps," he said slowly, though his tone suggested he did not fully believe the simple explanation any more than she did. Neither of them spoke of it further that day, but the incident spread through the castle regardless, whispered from servant to servant, from guard to guard, until by evening it seemed as though every soul within Thornwood's walls had heard some version of the story. The king's wolf had calmed for the maid. The king's wolf, silent and grieving for 6 long years, had responded to her presence as though she were something precious, something worth protecting. Marta found Illyra later that night in the kitchens, her sharp eyes studying her with an intensity that made Illyra distinctly uncomfortable. "Do you know what they are saying about you in the guard barracks tonight?" Marta asked, her voice low despite the empty kitchen around them. "I can imagine," Illyra said tiredly, sinking onto a stool near the hearth. "They are saying you calmed him with nothing but your voice. They are saying his wolf recognized you as something more than a servant." Marta set down the pot she had been scrubbing and crossed her arms, studying Illyra with an expression that mixed concern and something close to reluctant wonder. "Girl, do you understand what that could mean? Do you understand what it means for a wolf to respond that way to someone who is not their mate?" Illyra's breath caught slightly, though she tried to keep her voice steady. "I am certain there is a simpler explanation." "Perhaps," Marta said, though her tone suggested she did not believe it any more than Ronan had. "But simple explanations rarely satisfy hearts already halfway lost, my dear. And a king's heart, once it begins to wake after years of sleep, does not tend to fall back asleep quietly." That night, alone in her narrow servant's bed, Illyra stared up at the ceiling for a long time, replaying the moment in the great hall, over and over in her mind. She thought of the gold fading from his eyes at the sound of her voice. She thought of the way his shoulders had loosened beneath her steady presence, the way the entire dangerous energy of the room had shifted the instant she stepped forward. She did not yet have words for what was growing between them, this strange, quiet thing that had taken root somewhere in the weeks since that first terrible morning in his study. But she understood, with a certainty that both thrilled and frightened her in equal measure, that whatever it was, it had grown too large now to remain unnoticed, and in a castle full of watchful eyes and ambitious hearts, being noticed was rarely a safe thing to be. Far across the castle, in a chamber lit only by a single flickering candle, Lady Seraphine sat perfectly still at her writing desk, a folded piece of parchment resting untouched before her. She had heard the whispers too, carried swiftly to her ears by servants eager for her favor. A maid, a servant girl with no name, no title, no claim to anything, had somehow managed to calm the wolf that had remained silent and untouchable for 6 long years. Seraphine's fingers curled slowly against the desk, her expression sharpening into something cold and calculating beneath her composed exterior. She had spent 3 years positioning herself carefully at court, cultivating alliances, waiting patiently for the day Ronan would finally be ready to consider a new queen, a partner worthy of standing beside the Alpha King of Thornwood. She had not spent 3 years of careful patience only to watch it unravel because of some nameless maid who had wandered into the wrong room at the wrong moment. Her family's standing among the southern territories depended, in no small part, on the alliance she had long believed inevitable between herself and Thornwood's throne. Her father had invested considerable resources cultivating that expectation among their own people, and Seraphine understood, with the cold clarity that had always defined her approach to court politics, that failure to secure the match would carry consequences reaching far beyond her own personal disappointment. She thought of her father's stern expression, of the quiet expectation that had shaped every choice she made since coming of age, and felt her resolve harden further with each passing moment spent turning the problem over in her mind. She rose from her desk, moving toward the window that overlooked the dark, silent castle grounds, her mind already turning over possibilities, calculations, the first quiet threads of a plan that would need to be handled with the utmost care. Whatever this maid had stumbled into, however innocent or accidental it might have been, Seraphine had no intention of allowing it to continue unchecked. Some things, she thought coldly, watching the moonlight ripple across the distant tree line, needed to be removed before they had the chance to grow roots too deep to tear out cleanly. The following days brought no outward sign of Seraphine's growing displeasure, and Alira, still unaware of the quiet scheming taking shape behind the noblewoman's composed exterior, continued her duties with the same steady dedication she had always shown. She noticed, however, subtle shifts within the castle that she could not quite explain, conversations that quieted when she entered a room, servants who suddenly found urgent reasons to be elsewhere whenever she approached, a tension that seemed to hover just beneath the surface of every interaction, present but never quite spoken aloud. Ronan noticed it too, though he said little about it directly, choosing instead to increase the frequency of their meetings, as though determined to counter whatever quiet resistance was building around them with his own unwavering presence. He began requesting her assistance with tasks that clearly required no assistance at all, organizing correspondence he could easily have managed himself, reviewing reports that needed no additional set of eyes. Alira understood, without either of them acknowledging it plainly, that these small excuses were his way of ensuring she remained close, protected within the orbit of his presence, even as unease continued rippling quietly through the castle around them. One evening, as they worked together late into the night, sorting through a particularly tedious stack of trade agreements from the southern territories, Ronan set down his quill and studied her for a long moment, an unreadable expression settling over his sharp features. "Does it trouble you," he asked finally, "the way people watch you now?" Alira considered the question carefully before answering. "I have been watched with suspicion before, my lord, in circumstances far more dangerous than curious glances in castle corridors. I have learned, over time, that other people's discomfort with something they do not understand is rarely a reliable measure of whether that thing deserves to exist." Ronan's expression softened at her words, something like admiration crossing his features. "You carry wisdom, well beyond your years, Alira Voss. I carry scars, well beyond my years, she corrected gently. Wisdom is simply what remains, once the pain of earning those scars has finally settled into something more useful. He reached across the desk then, covering her hand with his own. A small, simple gesture that nonetheless carried the weight of everything neither of them had yet found the courage to say aloud. Neither pulled away, and for a long moment, the tedious work before them was entirely forgotten, replaced by a quiet understanding that continued deepening with each passing day, regardless of the watchful, calculating eyes gathering steadily in the shadows around them. By the time autumn settled fully over Thornwood, the whispers had spread far beyond the guard barracks and the servants' quarters. They moved through the castle like a slow, persistent wind, finding their way into every corner, every hushed conversation, every sidelong glance cast in Alira's direction as she went about her duties. The maid who calmed the king, the girl his wolf had chosen to notice, after 6 long years of silence. No one dared say the word mate aloud. Not yet, not with any certainty, but the possibility hung in the air regardless, thick and unmistakable. Alira felt the change most keenly in the way people looked at her now. Where once she had been invisible, simply another servant moving quietly through the halls, she now drew eyes wherever she walked. Some looks held curiosity, others held something closer to resentment, sharp and assessing, as though the onlookers were trying to determine what exactly made her worthy of an attention she had never sought. She tried, in the weeks that followed the council meeting, to keep her distance from the growing rumors, to focus simply on her duties, and let the whispers pass over her, like weather she could not control. But distance proved harder to maintain than she expected, particularly because Ronan himself seemed increasingly reluctant to let her keep it. He found reasons now to seek her out, beyond her regular duties, small excuses, that neither of them acknowledged for what they truly were. He asked her opinion on correspondence that required no opinion at all. He requested she accompany him on brief walks through the castle gardens, ostensibly to discuss household matters that could easily have been handled by a note. He began, without either of them fully noticing the shift, to seek out her company, simply for the sake of it. And she found herself, despite every warning bell sounding quietly in the back of her mind, unable to resist the pull of his presence, any more than he seemed able to resist hers. It was during one such walk through the gardens, beneath a canopy of trees just beginning to turn gold with the changing season, that Alira first noticed Lady Seraphine watching them from the shadowed archway near the eastern gate. The noblewoman's expression was composed, perfectly pleasant, the kind of practiced calm that Alira had learned, through years of careful observation, usually concealed something far less pleasant beneath it. "You know Lady Seraphine, I assume?" Ronan said, following her gaze with obvious reluctance. "Only by reputation, my lord. She has made her interest in a formal courtship known to the council on more than one occasion," Ronan said, his tone carefully neutral. "Her family holds significant influence among the southern territories. It would be, by every practical measure, an advantageous match." Something cold settled in Alira's chest at his words, though she kept her expression carefully composed, refusing to let him see whatever complicated emotion had risen so suddenly within her. "Then perhaps you should consider her offer, my lord, if it serves the pack's interests." Ronan stopped walking, turning to look at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, despite her best efforts to remain unaffected. "Is that truly what you believe I should do?" "It is not my place to say what you should do," Alira replied carefully. "That is not what I asked," Ronan said, stepping closer, close enough that she could see the faint gold beginning to stir at the edges of his storm-gray eyes, a sign she had learned to recognize as strong emotion straining against careful control. "I asked what you believe." Alira held his gaze, her heart pounding hard enough that she was certain he must be able to hear it. "I believe," she said slowly, choosing each word with great care, "that a man should not bind himself to someone simply because it is advantageous, when his heart has clearly not finished healing from what it lost before." Something shifted in Ronan's expression at her words, softening in a way that made the careful distance she had tried to maintain between them feel suddenly, dangerously thin. He opened his mouth as though to respond, but before he could speak, the sound of approaching footsteps on the garden path made them both step back, putting a more appropriate distance between them, just as one of the castle stewards rounded the corner, bearing an urgent message that required the king's immediate attention. The moment passed, but it lingered in Alira's mind long after Ronan had been called away, a fragile, unfinished thing that left her both hopeful and terrified in equal measure. Lady Seraphine, watching the entire exchange from her position near the archway, had seen enough. She waited until Alira had also departed the gardens before making her way toward her private chambers, her mind working swiftly through the possibilities now laid before her. That evening, she summoned a young guardsman named Fenwick to her chambers, a man whose gambling debts she had quietly settled some months prior, ensuring his loyalty through obligation rather than affection. He arrived nervous, fidgeting slightly under her cool, assessing gaze. "I have a task for you," Seraphine said, pouring 2 glasses of wine and offering one to him with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Nothing that need concern you greatly. I only require information. I want to know everything about the maid called Alira Voss, where she came from, who she corresponds with, whether her position here was secured through any connections worth investigating. Everything, Fenwick. No detail is too small. May I ask why, my lady?" Seraphine's smile sharpened slightly. "You may not, but you may consider your continued position within these walls dependent on your discretion in this matter." Fenwick nodded quickly, understanding the implicit threat well enough, and departed to begin his quiet investigation. Over the following days, Alira noticed the shift in atmosphere around her without fully understanding its source. Servants who had once greeted her warmly now seemed to hesitate before speaking with her, their eyes darting nervously toward corners and doorways, as though worried about being observed. Marta, usually so forthright, grew quieter around her, offering only cautious half-answers when Alira asked if something troubled her. "Just be careful, girl," Marta finally said one evening, pulling Alira aside in the empty kitchen. "There are eyes in this castle that do not wish you well. Powerful eyes, with the means to make life difficult for those who draw their displeasure." "I have done nothing wrong," Alira said, though a knot of unease had begun forming in her stomach. "That has rarely mattered to people like Lady Seraphine," Marta replied grimly. "Doing nothing wrong has never protected anyone from those determined to see them fall regardless." Despite the warning, Alira continued her duties as she always had, refusing to let fear dictate her actions, a stubbornness that had served her well through every hardship she had faced before arriving at Thornwood. She continued bringing tea to Ronan's chambers each morning, continued walking with him through the gardens when he requested her company, continued allowing the quiet, careful bond between them to deepen with each passing day, even as the whispers around them grew louder and increasingly less kind. It was nearly 3 weeks after the garden conversation that Ronan finally addressed the growing rumors directly, catching Alira alone in his study one evening as she gathered the day's correspondence. "You have heard what they are saying about us," he said, his voice carrying none of its usual authority, sounding instead almost uncertain, a tone she had rarely heard from him. "I have heard many things, my lord," Alira replied carefully. "I try not to give too much weight to castle gossip." "And if there were truth to it," Ronan pressed, moving closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his gaze. "What then?" Alira's breath caught in her throat, the careful distance she had maintained for weeks, suddenly feeling impossibly fragile beneath the weight of his question. "I do not know how to answer that, my lord. I am only a maid. Whatever this is between us, it changes nothing about that reality." "It changes everything about that reality," Ronan said quietly, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that made her chest ache with an emotion too large and too frightening to name. "My wolf has not responded to another living soul in 6 years, Alira. Not until you. I do not fully understand what that means yet, but I know I am no longer willing to pretend it means nothing." Before either of them could say more, a sharp knock at the door interrupted the moment, followed by the anxious voice of a guardsman reporting an urgent matter along the southern border. Ronan stepped back reluctantly, the careful mask of authority settling back over his features, as duty called him away once more. But as Alira watched him leave, her heart still pounding from words that had come dangerously close to a confession neither of them was yet ready to fully claim, she felt a shiver of unease settle over her, a quiet certainty that whatever was growing between them had already been noticed by people who intended to see it destroyed before it had the chance to fully bloom. She did not yet know how right that instinct would prove to be, nor how soon the danger gathering in the shadows of Thornwood Castle would finally show its face. In the days following that near confession in his study, Elira noticed Ronan growing bolder in small, deliberate ways, as though having admitted even that much aloud had loosened something he had kept carefully restrained for years. He began seeking her out at meals rather than simply having food delivered to his chambers separately, insisting she join him at the smaller family table, rather than eating alone in the servants' hall as custom dictated. He asked after her opinions on pack matters that carried real weight, listening to her responses with genuine consideration, rather than the polite indulgence a king might typically offer a servant's thoughts. Word of these changes spread quickly, as everything within Thornwood's walls tended to, and not every reaction proved as accepting as Marta's cautious optimism. Several of the older council members began requesting private audiences with Ronan, their concerns carefully worded but unmistakable in their underlying message. A king's attention toward a servant girl, however innocent, risked undermining the careful political balance the pack had maintained for years, particularly with several rival territories watching Thornwood's internal affairs with keen, opportunistic interest. Ronan dismissed these concerns each time they were raised, his patience with such political maneuvering visibly thinning with each passing week. This pack has survived far greater threats than the disapproval of council members too comfortable in their own traditions, he told Elira one evening, frustration evident in the tight set of his jaw. I will not apologize for choosing my own path forward, regardless of whose expectations that choice fails to satisfy. Perhaps, Elira said carefully, their concerns are not entirely without merit, my lord. I have no lineage to offer this pack, no political alliance to strengthen your position among rival territories. If I truly matter to you, perhaps the wisest course would be caution, at least until the council's concerns can be properly addressed. Caution has cost me 6 years of a life I should have been living, Ronan replied, his voice softening, even as his conviction remained unshaken. I am finished being cautious, Elira. Whatever the council fears, whatever politics demand, I trust my own judgment in this matter above all else. His certainty, though comforting, did little to ease the quiet unease that had begun settling over Elira in recent days, a persistent sense that the growing attention surrounding their bond was drawing eyes far more dangerous than disapproving council members, eyes that would not content themselves with simple political objection, when far more permanent solutions remained available to those willing to pursue them. The attack came on a cold evening nearly a month later, when the last golden leaves had finally fallen from the garden trees, and the first true frost of the season had begun creeping across the castle grounds. Elira had been sent to gather herbs from the small walled garden near the eastern wall, a task she had performed dozens of times without incident, and she thought little of the fading light as she moved between the frost-touched rows, her basket slowly filling with the last of the season's rosemary and sage. She noticed the silence first. The garden, usually alive with the distant sounds of the castle beyond its walls, the calls of guards on patrol, the clatter of kitchen work drifting from open windows, had gone strangely, unnaturally quiet. Elira paused, her basket half full, an old instinct honed through years of hardship prickling at the back of her neck. She was not alone. 3 figures emerged from the shadows near the garden's far wall, moving with the deliberate, coordinated grace of trained fighters rather than ordinary intruders. Elira's heart lurched painfully in her chest as she took an instinctive step backward, her mind racing through the layout of the garden, searching desperately for the nearest exit, the fastest path back toward the safety of the castle proper. No need to run, the tallest of the 3 said, his voice carrying a cold, mocking edge that made the hair on Elira's arms rise. We only wish to have a conversation, a brief one. Who sent you? Elira demanded, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear pounding through her veins. That hardly matters, the man replied, taking a slow step closer, the other 2 flanking him with practiced precision. What matters is that a servant girl has forgotten her place in this castle. Getting close to a king who is not yours to claim tends to draw unwanted attention. We are simply here to remind you of that fact. Elira's mind raced. She had no weapon, no training in combat, nothing but her own wits and the desperate hope that someone within the castle might notice her absence before it was too late. She backed further away, keeping the low garden wall at her back, buying herself precious seconds, as the 3 men closed the distance between them, with unhurried confidence, clearly enjoying the fear they believed they had already secured. She did not scream, though every instinct told her to. Instead, she reached deep for the same steady calm that had carried her through every hardship she had ever faced, forcing her breathing to slow, her mind to focus on options rather than panic. The first man lunged toward her, and Alira twisted aside with a speed she did not know she possessed, the movement born entirely of desperate instinct rather than any real skill. His hand caught her sleeve, tearing the fabric as she wrenched free, stumbling backward into the frost-hardened dirt of the garden bed. Pain flared sharp and sudden along her forearm, where his grip had scraped against her skin, but she scrambled upright regardless, refusing to let herself fall further into their reach. "Feisty," one of the others remarked, an ugly amusement coloring his voice. "This will not take long." It was in that moment, as the three men closed in once more, that something shifted in the air around them, a sudden drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the season, a pressure that made even the hardened attackers hesitate, glancing uneasily toward the garden's entrance. Ronan arrived not as a man, but as something far closer to the legend the entire castle whispered about in fearful tones. He had fully shifted, his massive form a blur of dark fur and barely contained power, as he tore through the garden gate, the wood splintering apart beneath the force of his entry, as though it were nothing more than kindling. His eyes, fully gold now, fixed on the scene before him with an intensity that made even Alira's blood run cold, though she knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever fury had brought him here was not aimed at her. The three attackers scattered, their earlier confidence evaporating instantly, in the face of an alpha whose bond had just been threatened. Alira watched, frozen against the garden wall, as Ronan moved with terrifying speed and precision, driving the intruders back toward the shattered gate, his low growl vibrating through the very stones of the garden walls. The confrontation was swift and decisive, the three men fleeing into the darkness beyond the garden, long before any true harm could be done to them, though Alira suspected, from the barely restrained fury still radiating off Ronan's massive form, that only her presence had prevented a far more severe outcome. When the last of the intruders had vanished into the tree line, Ronan turned back toward her, his enormous wolf form slowly beginning to recede, shifting back into the man she knew, though his eyes remained gold, wild with an emotion she had never seen so openly displayed on his face before. Alira. Her name tore from him like something broken, and he crossed the remaining distance between them in 3 swift strides, his hands finding her shoulders with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible, given the barely leashed power still radiating from him. "Are you hurt?" "I am well," she said, though her voice trembled slightly, the shock of the encounter finally beginning to settle over her, now that the immediate danger had passed. Only a scrape. Nothing serious. His eyes found the torn sleeve of her dress, the thin line of blood beading along her forearm, and something dark and dangerous flickered across his expression, a promise of consequences that made Alira instinctively reach for his arm, an attempt to ground him back in the present moment, rather than whatever violent path his thoughts had begun to travel. "They are gone," she said softly. "I am safe now. You found me in time." Ronan's jaw tightened, and for a long moment, he simply held her gaze, his breathing still uneven from the intensity of the shift, from the raw fear and fury that had driven him here, with such terrifying speed. "I felt it," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "I felt your fear, Alira, as though it were my own. I was 3 corridors away, and I felt it as clearly as if you had screamed directly into my ear." Alira's breath caught, understanding, beginning to dawn, despite her attempts to keep the realization at bay. "That is not possible, unless you are my mate," Ronan finished quietly, the words hanging heavy in the cold evening air between them. "I have suspected it for weeks now, Alira. I did not want to believe it, did not want to burden you with the weight of what that means, but I cannot deny it any longer, not after tonight." Before Alira could respond, could even begin to process the enormity of what he had just confirmed, Ronan gathered her carefully into his arms, lifting her with an ease that spoke to his considerable strength, despite the exhaustion clearly weighing on him now that the adrenaline of the confrontation had begun to fade. "Come," he said quietly. "You need rest, and your injury needs proper attention. I will not leave your side tonight, whatever anyone in this castle might have to say about it." Alira did not protest as he carried her from the ruined garden and back toward the safety of the castle, her mind still reeling from the confirmation of what she had begun, quietly and fearfully, to suspect for weeks now. She was his mate. The wolf that had remained silent and grieving for 6 long years had chosen her, had recognized something in her that even she did not fully understand, and that recognition had just placed a target on her back that she was only beginning to comprehend the true danger of. As Ronan carried her through the darkened castle corridors, servants and guards alike stepping back in stunned silence at the sight of their king, still faintly marked by the remnants of his shift, cradling the maid so protectively against his chest, neither of them noticed the figure watching from a shadowed window above. Lady Seraphine's expression twisted with a fury she made no attempt to hide now that she believed herself unobserved. Her carefully hired attackers had failed. Worse, their failure had done nothing but confirm, beyond any remaining doubt, exactly what she had feared from the very beginning. The bond between the king and his maid was real, and it had just been sealed tighter than ever by the very danger meant to break it apart. Seraphine turned from the window, her mind already racing toward more drastic measures, understanding now that subtlety alone would never be enough to remove the obstacle standing between her and everything she had spent years working to secure. If quiet schemes could not break this bond apart, then perhaps it was time to consider methods far less concerned with subtlety, and far more concerned with results. In the aftermath of the attack, the castle physician tended carefully to the shallow wound along Elira's forearm, pronouncing it minor enough to heal cleanly within days, though the deeper shock of the encounter lingered far longer than the physical injury itself. Ronan refused to leave her side that night, positioning himself in a chair beside her bed, despite her gentle protests, that he need not trouble himself so thoroughly over a wound so small. "It is not the wound that concerns me," he admitted quietly, watching her with an intensity that made her chest ache with a tenderness she had not expected to feel so strongly. "It is how close I came to losing you, before I ever found the courage to claim what my wolf already knew months ago." "You found me in time," Elira reminded him softly. "That is what matters now." "This time," Ronan said, his jaw tightening, "I cannot guarantee I will always be close enough to feel your fear before it becomes something worse. Whoever sent those men will not simply give up after one failed attempt. I know enough of court politics to understand that much." The following morning, Ronan doubled the guard presence throughout the castle grounds, particularly around the gardens and the servants' quarters where Elira spent most of her time. He also began teaching her, in quiet sessions held during the early evening hours, basic techniques for self-defense, insisting that whatever else might be uncertain about the danger still surrounding them, she would not face any future threat as helplessly as she had faced this one. "I have never held a weapon before," Elira admitted during their first lesson, eyeing the small blade he had placed carefully in her hands. "Then we begin simply," Ronan said, positioning himself behind her, his hands guiding her grip with patient precision. "You do not need to become a warrior overnight, Elira. You only need enough skill to buy yourself the time required for help to reach you, should it ever come to that again." The lessons became, over the following weeks, another quiet thread woven into the growing fabric of their bond. Evenings spent close together beneath the fading autumn light, Ronan's patient instruction interspersed with easy conversation, and moments of shared laughter that neither of them had expected to find amid such serious circumstances. Elira found herself growing stronger, both in body and in the quiet, steady confidence that had always defined her, even as the shadow of whoever had sent those attackers continued to linger, unresolved, somewhere beyond the castle's carefully guarded walls. In the days that followed the attack in the garden, Elira found herself caught between two entirely different versions of Ronan Blackthorn, and she could not determine which one frightened her more. There was the man who had carried her through the castle corridors with such fierce, unguarded tenderness, who had sat beside her bed long into the night, ensuring her injury had been properly tended, who had spoken the word mate aloud as though it were both a gift and a terrible burden he could no longer deny carrying. And then, almost as swiftly as that man had appeared, he seemed to vanish again, replaced by someone colder, more distant, someone who watched her from across rooms with an expression she could not quite read, but that made her chest ache regardless. He stopped seeking her out for the small, unnecessary excuses he had once invented so easily. He no longer requested her company on walks through the gardens. When their duties required them to be in the same room, his conversation remained clipped, formal, carefully professional, in a way that felt like a deliberate wall being rebuilt brick by careful brick between them. Alira did not understand the sudden shift, not at first, and the confusion of it hurt, in ways she had not expected, ways that made her question every quiet moment they had shared over the past months. Every gesture she had believed carried meaning beyond simple kindness. She found him one evening in his study, staring into the fire with the same distant expression she remembered from that very first night, though this time no wildness stirred in his eyes, only a deep, quiet exhaustion that seemed to have settled into his very bones. "You have been avoiding me," she said, setting down the tray she carried, no longer bothering to soften the observation with careful diplomacy. Ronan did not look up from the fire. "I have been occupied with pack matters." "That is a lie," Alira said, and though her voice remained steady, she felt something raw and hurt breaking through the careful composure she had maintained for days now. "You have not looked at me directly, since the night you carried me from the garden. What has changed, Ronan?" It was the first time she had used his name without title, and the sound of it seemed to finally pull his attention away from the fire, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers with an expression heavy with something that looked uncomfortably close to grief. "Everything has changed," he said quietly. "That is precisely the problem. I do not understand." Ronan rose slowly from his chair, moving to stand near the window, putting physical distance between them, even as his voice grew softer, more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. "Do you know what it means, Alira, to be a mate to an alpha? It is not a simple bond of affection that can be walked away from if circumstances grow difficult. It is permanent, unbreakable. Once fully claimed, the connection cannot be undone, not by distance, not by time, not by anything short of death itself." "I am not asking you to walk away from anything," Alira said, though her voice trembled slightly now. "I have asked for nothing from you at all." "That is exactly why this frightens me," Ronan said, turning to face her fully now, his expression stripped of the careful control he usually wore so effortlessly. "Celine asked for nothing either. She never once asked me to protect her more carefully, to place additional guards around her, to take the threats against our pack more seriously than I did. I failed her regardless, Alira. My failure to protect what I loved most cost her life, and I have carried that failure every single day since. I cannot watch it happen again. I cannot bear the thought of failing you the same way." Understanding began to dawn slowly through the hurt still coiled tight in Alira's chest, softening it into something closer to aching compassion. "So your solution is to push me away before you can fail me at all?" "My solution is to protect you, the only way I know how to guarantee," Ronan said, his voice raw now, stripped of every pretense. "Distance cannot fail you the way closeness can. If I keep you at arm's length, if I never allow this bond to fully claim either of us, then perhaps you remain safe from the same danger that claimed her." "That is not protection," Alira said, stepping closer, despite the careful distance he had tried to maintain. "That is simply a different kind of loss, one you are choosing to inflict on both of us before anyone else has the chance to. Do you truly believe distancing yourself from me erases the danger? The men who attacked me in the garden did not care whether you had claimed me fully or kept me at arm's length. They came because of what I already mean to you, whether you admit it aloud or not." Ronan flinched slightly at her words, the truth of them clearly landing harder than he had prepared for. "I do not know how to do this differently, Alira. I do not know how to love someone without the terror of losing them consuming every moment of that love." "Then perhaps," Alira said softly, closing the last of the distance between them, reaching up to rest her hand gently against his chest, feeling the rapid, unsteady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "You allow yourself to be afraid, and love regardless. Fear and love are not opposites, Ronan. I have learned that much in my own life. They can exist together, side by side, without one having to destroy the other." For a long moment, he simply stood there, her hand resting against his chest, his own hand slowly rising to cover hers, holding it in place, as though afraid she might pull away if he did not. When he finally spoke, his voice had softened into something almost broken, entirely unguarded. "I am terrified," he admitted quietly, "more terrified than I have been of anything, since the night I lost her. Not of my own wolf, not of rival packs, not of any threat this crown has ever placed before me. I am terrified of what it would do to me, to lose you the same way, after everything I have already survived." "Then let us survive it together," Alira said, her own voice trembling now with the weight of everything unspoken between them finally rising to the surface. "Whatever comes, whatever threats gather against us, I would rather face it standing beside you than watch you push me away in some misguided attempt to spare us both a pain that distance cannot actually prevent." Ronan's hand tightened around hers, and slowly, carefully, as though afraid the moment might shatter beneath too sudden a movement, he drew her closer, resting his forehead gently against hers, his breath uneven, his entire frame trembling with an emotion he had clearly kept locked away for far too long. "I do not deserve the courage you carry so easily," he murmured. "Perhaps," Elira replied softly. "Courage is simply choosing to stay, even when leaving would be far easier." They remained like that for a long while, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, the weight of 6 years of grief and weeks of careful distance finally beginning to dissolve into something new, something fragile, but undeniably real. Neither of them spoke further that night of mates or bonds, or the dangers still gathering in the shadows beyond the castle walls. For that one quiet evening, they allowed themselves simply to exist together, unguarded, in the fragile peace of an understanding finally reached. But peace within Thornwood Castle, as both of them would soon learn, rarely lasted longer than the candlelight that illuminated it. Even as Ronan finally allowed himself to hope, Lady Seraphine's carefully laid plans had already begun moving forward in the shadows, patient and precise, waiting only for the right moment to strike at the one vulnerability neither Ronan nor Elira had yet thought to guard against. In the days that followed their quiet reconciliation, Ronan seemed to shed years of accumulated weariness, the change so visible that even servants who rarely interacted directly with the king began remarking on it among themselves. He laughed more easily now, a sound that had grown so rare within the castle walls that its return felt almost startling to those who had served him through the long, silent years of his grief. He sought Elira's company openly, without the careful pretense of unnecessary tasks, simply because he wanted to be near her, a truth neither of them bothered concealing any longer. Elira, for her part, found herself settling into Thornwood in ways she had not believed possible when she first arrived, with nothing but a letter of recommendation and a stubborn refusal to be afraid. The castle, once a place of careful survival, had slowly transformed into something she found herself thinking of as home, its cold stone corridors warmed by the growing bond she shared with the man who ruled within them. They spent quiet evenings together in his study, the same room where their story had first begun months before, now filled with warmth rather than wreckage, laughter rather than grief. Ronan told her stories of Thornwood's history, of the ancient bonds between alphas and their mates that had shaped the pack's traditions long before either of them had been born. Elira, in turn, shared more of her own past, painful memories she had long kept carefully guarded, finding in his patient, unwavering attention a safety she had not realized she still needed. "I used to believe," she admitted one evening, watching the fire crackle softly in the hearth, "that losing everything meant I would never again have anything worth protecting. It felt safer that way somehow, to expect nothing, rather than risk losing something precious all over again." "And now?" Ronan asked quietly, reaching for her hand. "Now I understand that refusing to hope does not actually protect you from loss," Elira said softly, echoing the very words she had once offered him. "It only guarantees you never get to experience what might have been possible, had you allowed yourself the courage to try." Ronan lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, his storm-gray eyes holding hers, with a warmth that had been entirely absent from them the night they first met. "Then let us both continue choosing courage, Elira Voss. Whatever challenges still wait for us beyond these walls." Neither of them could have known, in that quiet, hopeful moment, exactly how soon those challenges would arrive, or how severely the fragile peace they had only just begun to build would be tested in the days that followed. The accusation came 3 weeks later, on a morning that had begun like any other, with Elira carrying the usual tray of tea toward Ronan's chambers before the castle had fully woken. She never reached his door. Halfway across the great hall, she found her path blocked by 4 armed guards, their expressions grim, their captain holding a rolled parchment that bore the official seal of the Pack Council. "Elira Voss," the captain said, his voice carrying the weight of formal duty rather than personal malice, "you are to come with us. You stand accused of theft against the crown." The tray slipped from her hands, shattering against the stone floor, tea and porcelain scattering in every direction, as shock rippled through her entire body. There must be some mistake. I have taken nothing that does not belong to me. The Ember Stone, a relic belonging to the royal treasury, has gone missing from its case, the captain continued, clearly uncomfortable with the task before him, but unwilling to deviate from his orders. It was discovered hidden among your belongings during a search conducted this morning, by order of the council. That is impossible, Elira said, panic beginning to claw its way up through her chest. I have never even seen this stone. Someone has done this deliberately. That will be determined at your trial, the captain said, though his eyes held something almost apologetic as two of the guards moved to flank her. Please, do not make this more difficult than it needs to be. Word reached Ronan within minutes, and by the time Elira was brought before the assembled council in the great hall, he had already arrived, his expression carved from barely contained fury, his eyes flickering dangerously toward gold, as he took in the sight of guards, flanking the woman he had only weeks before, finally allowed himself to claim as his mate. Explain this, he demanded, his voice cracking through the hall like a whip. Lady Seraphine stepped forward from among the assembled council members, her expression arranged into careful, practiced concern that did not reach the calculating gleam in her eyes. My lord, I understand this is difficult to accept, but the evidence is quite clear. The Ember Stone was found hidden beneath the floorboard of Miss Voss's chamber this very morning, discovered during a routine inspection, conducted after suspicions were raised by several members of the household staff. What suspicions? Ronan demanded. Raised by whom? Does it truly matter, my lord, when the evidence itself speaks so plainly? Seraphine's voice remained soft, reasonable, every word calculated to appear as though she carried no personal stake in the matter at all. The Ember Stone is one of the pack's oldest relics, said to hold significant power tied to the founding bloodline. Its theft is no small matter. Regardless of who committed it, pack law is clear on punishments for such crimes, whatever personal feelings might complicate the council's judgment in this particular case. Elira felt the eyes of the entire council upon her, felt the weight of accusation pressing down like a physical force, and though her mind raced desperately for some explanation, some proof of her innocence, she found herself with nothing but her own word against evidence that had clearly been placed with deliberate, damning precision. I did not do this, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, despite the fear coursing through her. I have never touched this stone. I do not even know what it looks like. A convenient claim, one of the older council members said, his tone skeptical. Though hardly surprising, given the circumstances. She is telling the truth, Ronan said, moving to stand directly beside Elira, a clear, unmistakable display of protection that drew murmurs from across the assembled council. I know this woman. She would not steal from this pack. With respect, my lord, Seraphine said carefully, your judgment in this particular matter has perhaps grown somewhat clouded, given your personal attachment to the accused. Pack law exists precisely to ensure fairness, even in cases where those closest to the throne might wish for a different outcome. The words landed with calculated precision, and Elira watched several council members nod slowly, clearly swayed by the implication that Ronan's feelings for her had compromised his objectivity. She felt the ground shifting beneath her, felt the careful trap closing tighter around her with every passing moment, and understood, with dawning horror, exactly what Seraphine had orchestrated. This was never truly about a stolen relic. This was about removing an obstacle that threatened everything Seraphine had spent years working to secure. Pack law demands a formal trial, the eldest council member announced, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and precedent. 3 days from now, before the full assembly. If found guilty, the punishment for theft of a founding relic is banishment, at minimum, though some among this council may argue for harsher measures given the significance of what was taken. This is absurd, Ronan said, fury barely restrained beneath his controlled exterior. I will not allow an innocent woman to be tried on fabricated evidence. Then prove it fabricated, my lord, Seraphine said smoothly. At the trial, before the full council, as tradition demands. Anything less would set a dangerous precedent, suggesting that pack law bends according to personal feeling, rather than standing firm for all members equally, regardless of their relationship to the throne. Ronan's jaw tightened, and Alira could see the war raging behind his eyes, the desperate desire to simply declare her innocent and end the matter through sheer force of authority, warring against the deeper understanding that such an action would only fracture the fragile trust between himself and a council already growing uneasy about his attachment to a servant girl with no title, no lineage, no claim to legitimacy beyond the bond his wolf had chosen. 3 days, he said finally, his voice tight with restrained fury, and I will personally ensure the truth of this matter comes to light, whatever it takes. As the guards led Alira away toward the chambers where she would be held until the trial, she caught one final glimpse of Lady Seraphine's expression, and in that brief, unguarded moment, before the noblewoman could rearrange her features back into careful concern, Alira saw it clearly. Satisfaction. Cold, calculating satisfaction, the expression of someone who believed her carefully laid trap had finally closed exactly as intended. Alone in the small chamber where she would spend the next 3 days awaiting judgment, Alira sat by the narrow window, watching the last of the season's frost creep across the glass, and allowed herself, for the first time since the guards had found her, to feel the full weight of her fear. She thought of banishment, of being cast out from the only place she had begun, cautiously, to consider a home. She thought of Ronan, of the fragile understanding they had only just reached, of how quickly it might all be torn apart by lies, clever enough to look exactly like truth. But beneath the fear, something steadier remained, the same quiet resilience that had carried her through every hardship she had ever faced. She had survived worse than this. She had survived losing everything once already, and she had rebuilt herself from nothing into someone capable of catching the attention of a king's silent, grieving wolf. Whatever Seraphine had planned, whatever lies had been carefully constructed to destroy her, Alira refused to face them without fighting for the truth with everything she had left. 3 days, she told herself, watching the frost thicken slowly across the window glass. 3 days to prove her innocence, or lose everything she had only just begun to believe she might be allowed to keep. On the second night of her confinement, a soft knock sounded at her chamber door, and Alira looked up to find Marta slipping quietly inside, a small bundle clutched against her chest, and a fierce determination burning behind her usually guarded expression. "I do not have long," Marta said, setting the bundle down and revealing a simple meal, far warmer and more generous than the guards had been providing. "But I could not let another day pass without telling you what I have overheard among the kitchen staff." "What have you heard?" Alira asked, hope flickering cautiously in her chest, for the first time since her arrest. "Whispers, nothing more. But persistent ones," Marta said, lowering her voice further despite the empty room around them. "One of the younger guardsmen, a boy named Fenwick, has been seen slipping in and out of Lady Seraphine's private chambers at unusual hours these past months, and more than one servant recalls him near your quarters the very morning the stone was discovered, well before his patrol should have brought him anywhere close." Alira's breath caught, the pieces beginning to align with a clarity that both relieved and horrified her in equal measure. "You believe Seraphine orchestrated this entirely?" "I believe," Marta said carefully, "that ambition of the kind Lady Seraphine carries does not simply accept disappointment gracefully. I have served in this castle long enough to recognize the particular cruelty of those who believe their birthright entitles them to whatever they desire, regardless of the cost to those who stand in their way. Does the king know of this?" "I intend to seek him out the moment I leave this chamber," Marta said, rising and gathering the empty basket she had carried the meal within. "Whatever else may be uncertain in this castle, girl, know this much clearly. You are not without allies here, however quiet and unnoticed our support may seem from within these walls." She departed quickly after that, leaving Alira alone once more, with her thoughts, though the crushing weight of despair that had settled over her since her arrest had lifted, replaced now by a cautious, fragile hope that the truth, however carefully buried, might yet find its way to the surface before the trial's judgment could be rendered against her. She spent the remainder of that night turning Marta's words over carefully in her mind, piecing together fragments of behavior she had noticed herself but never fully examined, until finally, exhausted by the weight of uncertainty, she allowed herself to drift into a restless sleep, praying quietly that whatever Ronan and Marta uncovered in the hours remaining before her trial would prove enough to finally expose the truth hidden so carefully behind Lady Seraphine's composed and calculating exterior. While Alira remained confined to await her trial, Ronan threw himself into an investigation with the same fierce intensity he had once reserved only for matters of war. He summoned every servant who had access to the East Wing, questioned every guard who had stood watch near the treasury in recent weeks, and combed through every detail of the supposed discovery of the Emberstone with a precision that left no possibility unexamined. Marta proved an unexpected ally in this effort, her sharp eyes and years of quiet observation within the castle walls giving her insight into the household staff that even Ronan's official inquiries could not easily uncover. She came to him on the second evening of the investigation, her expression grave, a folded piece of parchment clutched tightly in her weathered hands. "My lord," she said, dropping into a respectful bow despite the urgency clearly driving her forward. "I believe I have found something that requires your immediate attention." The parchment contained a list, carefully compiled through Marta's quiet questioning of the kitchen and household staff, detailing every servant who had recently come into unexpected coin or favor without clear explanation. One name appeared prominently near the top, circled twice in Marta's careful handwriting. "Fenwick," Ronan read aloud, recognizing the name of a young guardsman assigned to the Eastern Patrol. "What do you know of him?" "Gambling debts, my lord. Settled quite suddenly some months back. Far beyond what his modest salary should have allowed him to clear on his own," Marta said. "And more recently, several of the kitchen staff reported seeing him near the servants' quarters on the very morning the stone was supposedly discovered, well before his usual patrol hours would have brought him anywhere near that wing of the castle." Ronan's expression darkened considerably. "Bring him to me." Fenwick arrived within the hour, escorted by 2 guards who had been given strict instructions regarding his treatment, and it took very little time, once seated across from an Alpha King whose barely restrained fury radiated through the room like heat from an open flame, for the young guardsman's composure to crumble entirely. "I did not know what it would be used for," Fenwick stammered, his hands trembling as he spoke. "Lady Seraphine approached me months ago, offered to settle my debts in exchange for information about the maid, nothing more at first. Simple questions about her habits, her background, where she came from, before Thornwood. It seemed harmless enough at the time." "And the stone?" Ronan pressed, his voice dangerously quiet now, a stillness far more threatening than any raised volume could have conveyed. "She came to me again 3 nights ago," Fenwick continued, clearly understanding that his only path forward now lay in complete honesty. "She gave me the stone herself, already removed from the treasury through means I do not fully understand, and instructed me to place it among Miss Voss's belongings before the morning inspection. I did not ask questions, my lord. I simply did as instructed, believing my debts would remain settled only if I cooperated fully. You will repeat every word of this before the full council at the trial," Ronan said, rising from his chair with a controlled deliberateness that somehow felt more dangerous than any outburst might have. "And you will do so without hesitation, or I promise you, whatever consequences Lady Seraphine might have threatened will feel like mercy compared to what awaits you should you attempt to protect her further." Fenwick nodded frantically, clearly grasping the severity of the choice now laid before him, and Ronan dismissed him under guard, his mind already turning toward the trial that would take place the following day, toward the careful presentation of evidence that would need to be assembled to ensure Seraphine's guilt could not be disputed or dismissed by a council still uncertain about the legitimacy of his bond with Alira. He visited Alira that evening, the guards outside her chamber stepping aside without question at his approach, and found her seated by the narrow window, exactly as she had been each time he visited over the past 2 days, her posture steady, despite the obvious strain the ordeal had placed upon her. "We have found the truth," he said without preamble, crossing the room quickly to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the barely controlled fury still simmering beneath his composed exterior. "Fenwick has confessed everything. Seraphine orchestrated all of it, from the theft itself to its placement among your belongings. He will testify before the full council tomorrow." Relief broke across Alira's face, so profound it brought sudden tears to her eyes. Tears she quickly blinked away, unwilling to let fear claim any more of her composure than it already had over the past difficult days. "Then this will finally be over." "Not entirely," Ronan said carefully, and something in his tone made Alira's relief falter slightly. "Fenwick's testimony proves your innocence, but it also confirms what I have suspected from the moment this accusation was first raised. Seraphine did not act alone out of simple malice. She acted out of calculated ambition, believing that removing you would clear the path towards securing her own position beside me. That kind of ambition does not simply retreat once exposed. It adapts. It finds new methods. What are you suggesting? Alira asked quietly. I am suggesting, Ronan said, his storm-gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt, that tomorrow's trial cannot simply end with your innocence proven and Seraphine's guilt exposed. It must end with something far more permanent. A declaration that leaves no room for future schemes. No ambiguity for anyone within this castle to exploit again. Alira's breath caught, understanding beginning to dawn at the weight carried within his careful words. You mean to claim me, publicly, before the entire council? I mean to stop hiding what has already claimed both of us, whether either of us was ready to admit it openly or not, Ronan said, his voice softening now, though the fierce determination behind it remained unmistakable. I have spent 6 years allowing fear to dictate the choices I make regarding my own heart. I am finished allowing that fear to place you in danger any longer. Tomorrow, before the full council, I intend to name you what you already are, my mate, my chosen partner, and I will let anyone who dares challenge that claim understand precisely what they will be facing should they attempt to threaten you again. Alira felt the weight of his words settle over her, equal parts terrifying and exhilarating, the culmination of everything that had grown quietly between them since that first terrible morning in his study months ago. The council may not accept it easily. I am no noblewoman. I carry no lineage, no title, nothing beyond the bond your wolf has chosen. The bond my wolf has chosen is the only qualification pack law has ever truly required, Ronan said firmly. Ancient tradition holds the mate bond above titles, above lineage, above every political consideration the council might wish to raise. Seraphine knew this. It is precisely why she worked so desperately to remove you, before that truth could be formally declared and made undeniable. He rose slowly, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, a rare display of tenderness that spoke volumes, despite its simplicity. Rest tonight, if you can. Tomorrow, everything changes, and I intend to ensure that when it does, no one within these walls will ever again believe you are anything less than exactly where you belong. As he departed, leaving Alira alone once more, with her thoughts racing through the enormity of what tomorrow would bring, she allowed herself, for the first time in 3 long, fearful days, to feel something closer to hope than dread. Whatever awaited her before the full council, whatever challenges Seraphine or her allies might still attempt to raise, she would not face them alone, and after everything she had survived to reach this moment, that certainty alone felt like enough to carry her through whatever remained ahead. Sleep proved elusive that final night before the trial, and Alira found herself, well past midnight, seated once again by the narrow window of her chamber, watching moonlight ripple silver across the frost-covered grounds below. She thought of everything that had brought her to this moment, of the long road from her scattered village to Thornwood's stone corridors, of the countless small choices that had led her, step by careful step, into the life of a king who had once seemed as distant and untouchable as the mountains surrounding his castle. She thought, too, of the courage it had taken him to finally speak the truth of their bond aloud, after 6 long years of guarding his heart so carefully that even he had nearly forgotten what it felt like to hope for something beyond simple survival. Whatever fear had once driven him to distance himself from her, whatever grief still lived quietly beneath his careful composure, he had chosen, in the end, to face it, rather than let it dictate his choices any longer. She understood, sitting alone in the quiet darkness of her chamber, that tomorrow would demand the same courage from her. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and she opened the door to find Ronan standing in the corridor, his expression carrying none of the exhaustion she might have expected after days spent investigating Seraphine's schemes so relentlessly. Instead, he looked steady, resolute, a man who had finally found solid ground beneath feet that had spent far too long, unmoored by grief and hesitation. I could not sleep either, he admitted, stepping inside at her invitation. I wanted to see you once more before tomorrow, to remind you that whatever the council decides, whatever challenges tomorrow brings, you will not face them alone. I know, Alira said softly, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she truly did believe it. They sat together for a while in comfortable silence, His arm settled protectively around her shoulders, the weight of tomorrow's trial pressing at the edges of their thoughts but no longer carrying the same crushing dread it had only hours before. When he finally rose to leave, ensuring she had every opportunity to rest before the demands of the following day, he paused at the door, turning back to look at her, with an expression so full of quiet devotion that it settled something deep and anxious within her chest. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said quietly, "know that my wolf chose well, Elira Voss. Better than I ever believed I deserved." He left her then, and though sleep still came slowly, when it finally did claim her, it carried none of the fear that had haunted her through the previous nights, replaced instead by a quiet, steady confidence that whatever tomorrow demanded of her, she would meet it exactly as she had met every hardship before it, with her chin held high, and her heart, however frightened, refusing to bend. The great hall had never held so many people at once, as it did on the morning of Elira's trial. Word of the accusation, and of the king's fierce defense of the accused, had spread through every corner of Thornwood territory, drawing not only the full pack council, but curious onlookers from across the surrounding lands, all eager to witness whatever judgment would finally be rendered. Elira stood before the assembled council with her chin held high, refusing to let the weight of so many watching eyes bend her posture into something smaller, something apologetic for a crime she had never committed. Ronan stood beside her, close enough that his presence radiated a silent, unmistakable protection, though he had agreed, at her quiet insistence, to let the evidence speak first, before he made any declaration that might overshadow the simple truth of her innocence. Lady Seraphine stood among the council members, her composure as carefully arranged as ever, though Elira noticed a subtle tension in the set of her shoulders that had not been present at the initial accusation days before. Word of Fenwick's confession had clearly reached her by now, and whatever confidence she had carried into this hall days ago had begun, visibly, to crack. The eldest council member called the proceedings to order, and Fenwick was brought forward, his hands bound, his expression carrying the particular misery of a man who understood he had run out of options for protecting himself through further deception. Under the weight of the full council's attention, he repeated every word of his confession from 2 nights before, describing in careful, damning detail how Lady Seraphine had approached him months ago, how she had provided him with the ember stone itself, how he had placed it among Elira's belongings under her explicit instruction. Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd as his testimony unfolded, and Elira watched Seraphine's expression shift by careful degrees, the practiced composure straining harder with each new detail Fenwick provided, until finally, when he described the exact evening she had delivered the stone into his hands, her control shattered entirely. "This is absurd," Seraphine snapped, stepping forward with a suddenness that drew every eye in the hall toward her. "A desperate man will say anything to save himself from punishment. You cannot possibly believe the word of a guilty guardsman over the testimony already presented against the accused." Several council members exchanged uneasy glances at Seraphine's outburst, clearly torn between the noblewoman's long-standing reputation within court circles and the mounting evidence now presented so plainly before them. Adela, the eldest among them, studied Seraphine with narrowed, calculating eyes, her expression giving away little of her own private judgment on the matter. "Then perhaps," Ronan said, his voice cutting through the hall with quiet, devastating precision, "the council would find additional evidence more convincing." At his signal, a guard stepped forward, presenting a small pouch that had been recovered, upon Ronan's direct order, from Seraphine's private chambers during a search conducted that very morning. Within it, carefully wrapped, lay a second relic, one that had gone missing from the treasury years earlier and had long been assumed permanently lost, a discovery that immediately raised troubling questions about exactly how long Seraphine's schemes had been operating undetected within the castle walls. "This was found in your chambers, Lady Seraphine," Ronan continued, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that left no room for further denial. "Perhaps you would care to explain how a relic missing for nearly 4 years came to rest among your private belongings, if you had no history of manipulating packed treasures for your own purposes." Seraphine's carefully maintained composure finally collapsed entirely, fury and desperation replacing the calm mask she had worn throughout the proceedings. "Everything I have done for the good of this pack," she said, her voice rising, sharp and bitter. "You have spent 6 years buried in grief, refusing every suitable match presented to you, weakening this pack's standing among our allies through your isolation. I sought only to secure a future for Thornwood that your mourning had left unattended. And now you would throw away everything I have worked toward, for the sake of some nameless maid with no lineage, no claim to legitimacy beyond whatever accident of fate drew your wolf's attention. She is not a nameless maid, Ronan said, his voice growing dangerously quiet now, the gold beginning to stir at the edges of his storm-gray eyes, as the full weight of his fury finally began to surface. She is Alira Voss, and she is my mate, chosen not by political calculation or careless accident, but by the same ancient bond that pack law has honored above titles and lineage since Thornwood's very founding. He turned, facing the full assembly now, his voice carrying with unmistakable authority through every corner of the silent hall. I have hesitated to declare this bond openly, out of fear for what claiming it fully might cost us both. That hesitation nearly cost Alira her freedom, and very possibly her life, through the schemes of someone who believed my silence left room for manipulation. I will not make that mistake again. He turned to face Alira directly now, his expression stripped of every careful guard he had maintained for 6 long years. Love and fierce protectiveness written plainly across every line of his face, for the entire assembly to witness. Alira Voss, before this council and every soul gathered within these walls, I claim you as my mate, my equal, and my chosen partner in leading this pack forward. Whatever consequence that claim carries, whatever tradition it challenges, I will bear it gladly, so long as it means never again allowing fear to place you in danger through my own hesitation. The ancient bonding mark rose along both their wrists as he spoke, a shimmering pattern neither of them had consciously summoned, visible proof witnessed by the entire council that the words he spoke carried the full weight of true mate magic, a claim that could not be forged, could not be disputed, could not be dismissed as mere political theater. Gasps rippled through the assembled crowd at the sight of it, and even the most skeptical council members exchanged glances that spoke plainly of understanding finally settling into place. Seraphine, faced with undeniable magical proof alongside Fenwick's testimony and the damning evidence of the second stolen relic, had no further argument left to offer. The council's judgment, when it finally came, was swift and absolute. Banishment, effective immediately, along with the stripping of her family's standing among the southern territories, a consequence severe enough to ensure her schemes would never again threaten the pack she had claimed to be protecting. As guards led her from the hall, her earlier composure entirely abandoned to bitter, furious protest, Alira felt the last of the fear that had gripped her for 3 long days finally begin to loosen its hold. She turned to look at Ronan, at the man who had just declared, before the entire assembled world, exactly what she meant to him, and found him watching her with an expression so open, so unguarded, that it took her breath away entirely. "It is done," he said softly, reaching for her hand, the bonding mark still faintly visible along both their wrists, a permanent testament to a truth that could never again be hidden or denied. No more shadows, no more hesitation, only this, from now forward, exactly as it should have been from the very beginning. Around them, the assembled crowd had begun to murmur, not with the suspicion and quiet resentment that had followed Alira through the castle halls for months, but with something closer to wonder, the beginnings of acceptance for a maid who had, against every impossible odd, captured the silent heart of a king everyone had once believed incapable of loving again. The eldest council member, a stern woman named Adela who had served 3 generations of Thornwood's ruling line, stepped forward once the hall's murmurs had settled, her sharp eyes studying both Ronan and Alira with an assessing gaze that carried decades of accumulated wisdom. "The bonding mark cannot be disputed," she said finally, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Pack law has recognized the mate bond above all political consideration since our founding, and this council will not be the first to challenge a tradition that has served Thornwood faithfully for generations." She turned toward Alira then, her expression softening slightly, though her posture remained formally correct. "Alira Voss, this council formally acknowledges your innocence in the matter of the stolen relic, and further acknowledges the bond confirmed today before witness. Should you accept the role, tradition dictates that you will be recognized as Luna of Thornwood Pack, standing equal beside your mate in matters of leadership and counsel." Alira, still absorbing the enormity of everything that had unfolded within the span of a single morning, found herself momentarily unable to summon words adequate to the moment. She glanced toward Ronan, finding in his steady, encouraging expression the same quiet strength that had carried her through every difficult moment since her arrest. And finally, drawing on the resilience that had defined her through every hardship life had placed before her, she turned back to face the assembled council. "I accept," she said, her voice carrying clearly, despite the trembling she still felt beneath her composed exterior. "And I promise, this pack, that whatever role I am given, I will carry it, with the same honesty and dedication I have tried to bring to every task set before me, since first arriving within these walls." The hall erupted into applause at her words, a response so different from the tense silence that had greeted her arrival days before, that Alira felt tears rising unbidden to her eyes, quickly blinked away, as Ronan drew her close, his arms settling protectively around her shoulders, as the full weight of everything that had just transpired finally began to settle over both of them. As the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing with excited conversation about the morning's dramatic revelations, Garrick approached them both, his usually gruff expression softened into something approaching genuine respect. "I owe you an apology," he said, addressing Alira directly. "I judged you unfairly, based on assumptions I had no right to make. Watching you stand before this council today, facing false accusation with more courage than most seasoned warriors could muster, has taught me something valuable about the true measure of strength." "Apology accepted," Alira said warmly, "though I understand your caution was born from loyalty to this pack, not malice toward me personally." Garrick nodded, something like respect settling into his weathered features as he stepped back to allow others their turn to offer congratulations and quiet apologies of their own. Alira, standing beside Ronan amid the warm, celebratory chaos that had replaced the morning's tense trial, felt something settle deeply into place within her chest, a sense of belonging she had not truly known since long before her family's village had been scattered by hardships beyond her control. She had come to Thornwood with nothing but a letter of recommendation and a stubborn refusal to be afraid. She was leaving this hall, months later, as Luna, of an entire pack, standing beside a king who had finally allowed himself to love again, fully and without hesitation, exactly as fate, it seemed, had always intended. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the mountains around Thornwood in a soft, unbroken white that made the castle look, for the first time in Alira's memory, less like a fortress and more like a place someone might actually call home. The weeks following the trial had passed in a quiet, steady rhythm, the castle slowly adjusting to a truth that had once seemed impossible, the maid who had walked calmly toward danger instead of away from it, becoming, day by day, less of a scandal and more simply a fact of Thornwood life that most had come to accept, and many had even come to welcome. Marta, predictably, took enormous pride in claiming she had seen it coming from the very beginning, though Alira suspected the older woman's early warnings about the dangers of catching the king's attention had carried far more genuine worry than foresight. Even Garrick, the gruff warrior whose challenge in the council hall had first drawn Alira into the tangled beginnings of this bond, had grudgingly offered his respect once the truth of her innocence and the strength of her character had become impossible to deny. The formal coronation was set for the first morning after the winter solstice, a date chosen deliberately by Ronan for its ancient significance, a turning point in the old traditions, when the longest night finally gave way to returning light. Alira stood now in the antechamber adjoining the great hall. Dressed in ceremonial robes she still found herself faintly disbelieving she was truly wearing, the fabric a deep midnight blue embroidered with silver thread that caught the candlelight like scattered stars. "You look as though you might run," Marta observed dryly, adjusting the fall of Alira's sleeve with practiced efficiency. "I have never run from anything in my life," Alira replied, though her voice carried a nervous edge that made Marta's stern expression soften into something almost fond. "No," Marta agreed, "you have not, which is precisely why you are standing here today, about to become Luna of an entire pack, rather than fleeing back down whatever road first brought you to this castle's doorstep." She stepped back, studying Alira with an appraising eye that held nothing but genuine warmth now. "He is a fortunate man, whatever fear once kept him from admitting it, and you, my dear, have earned every bit of what awaits you beyond those doors." The great hall, when the doors finally opened before her, had been transformed entirely from the tense, crowded space of the trial months before. Garlands of winter greenery wound along every column, candles burned steadily in every corner, and the assembled crowd, rather than watching with suspicion or quiet resentment, turned toward her with expressions of genuine welcome as she began the long walk toward the raised dais where Ronan waited. He stood tall in ceremonial dress befitting his station, but it was the expression on his face, rather than the finery he wore, that caught Alira's breath as she approached. Gone entirely was the guarded distance of the man she had first encountered in his ruined study all those months ago. In its place stood someone whose storm-gray eyes shone with open, unguarded joy, someone who had finally allowed 6 long years of careful walls to fall away completely. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of ancient words and ritual gestures, the pack elders invoking traditions older than the castle's stones themselves, binding not just a king to his mate, but a Luna to her people, a formal acknowledgement of the role Alira would now carry alongside the bond already sealed between them. When the final words were spoken, and Ronan placed the delicate silver circlet upon her brow, a symbol of her new station, the assembled hall erupted into genuine celebration, a sound so different from the tense silence of the trial that Alira found tears rising unbidden to her eyes. "You are trembling," Ronan murmured, drawing her close as the formal portion of the ceremony gave way to celebration around them. "I am simply still adjusting," Alira admitted softly, "to the idea that a girl who once had nothing, who arrived at this castle with only a letter of recommendation and a stubborn refusal to be afraid, now stands here as Luna of Thornwood Pack." "You were never simply a girl with nothing," Ronan said, his voice warm with a certainty that settled deep into her chest. "You were always exactly the kind of strength this pack needed, long before either of us understood what that strength would come to mean, for me personally. My wolf recognized it the very first night you walked into my study, instead of running from it, when every other soul in this castle had learned to fear even the sound of my voice." He drew her gently toward the tall windows lining the hall, away from the immediate press of celebration, and together, they looked out over the snow-covered grounds beyond, the same gardens where danger had once found her, now transformed into something peaceful beneath the winter's careful blanket. "I spent 6 years believing I had nothing left worth protecting," Ronan said quietly, his arms settling around her shoulders with easy, natural comfort. "I built walls around whatever remained of my heart, convinced that distance was the only true protection against loss. You taught me something I had forgotten entirely during those long, silent years, that refusing to love does not actually prevent loss. It simply guarantees a different kind of emptiness, one far harder to recover from than grief itself." "And now?" Alira asked softly, leaning into the warmth of his embrace. "Now," Ronan said, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple, "I intend to spend whatever years remain to us, making certain you never doubt, even for a moment, how completely you are loved. Not simply by the wolf that recognized you before I dared to admit it myself, but by the man standing beside you now, fully, without hesitation, without the fear that once nearly cost us both everything." Outside, snow continued falling softly over Thornwood's silent mountains, and within the great hall, celebration continued long into the night, marking not simply the crowning of a new Luna, but the quiet, hard-won triumph of a heart that had finally allowed itself, after years of careful silence, to heal completely. Alira Voss, once an invisible maid moving unnoticed through castle corridors, had become something far greater than she ever imagined possible when she first climbed those servant stairs toward a danger everyone else had learned to fear. She had become the one soul capable of reaching past 6 years of grief and silence, to touch not only the wolf hidden beneath a king's careful armor, but the wounded, grieving heart of the man himself. In the weeks that followed the coronation, the castle continued its quiet transformation, warmth and easy laughter replacing the careful, fearful silence that had once defined nearly every corner of its halls. Servants who had once whispered nervously about the king's temper now spoke openly of his newfound patience, of the small kindnesses he had begun extending to even the lowest-ranking members of his household, a change every long-serving member of the castle attributed, correctly, to the quiet influence of the Luna standing steadily beside him. Marta, granted a position of honor within the new Luna's household, took to her elevated role with the same brisk efficiency she had always shown, though those who knew her well noted a softness in her expression these days that had rarely been present before, a quiet pride in having watched a girl she had once warned so fiercely about the dangers of catching a king's attention rise instead to stand equal beside him. Elira settled into her new responsibilities with the same steady determination that had carried her through every previous hardship, learning the intricacies of pack governance alongside Ronan, offering counsel that increasingly proved as valuable to the council's deliberations as any voice that had come before her. She never forgot the lessons of her own difficult past, and used her position, whenever possible, to ensure that servants throughout the castle received the same dignity and consideration she herself had once been denied before fate, and a king's stubborn wolf, had intervened so dramatically on her behalf. On quiet evenings, when the demands of governing an entire pack finally allowed a few stolen hours of peace, Ronan and Elira could often be found in the same study where their story had first begun, the fire crackling warmly in the hearth, the room filled now with laughter and quiet conversation, rather than the wreckage of grief that had once dominated it so completely. Ronan spoke more freely now of Celine, of the years of happiness he had shared with her, before tragedy claimed everything, no longer treating those memories as wounds to be hidden away, but as part of the man he had become, a foundation upon which the new happiness he shared with Elira had somehow, impossibly, managed to build itself. "I used to believe," he confided one such evening, watching the firelight dance across Elira's peaceful expression, "that loving fully meant risking everything worth protecting. I understand now that refusing to love fully risks something far greater, the chance to have lived at all, rather than simply survived." Elira reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his with the same easy familiarity that had grown between them since that first terrible night when she had walked calmly into his ruined study instead of fleeing like everyone else. "We have both learned that lesson the hard way," she said softly. "Perhaps that is precisely why we found our way to each other, when every circumstance seemed determined to keep us apart." Outside the tall windows of the study, snow continued falling gently over Thornwood's silent mountains, the same peaceful scene that had witnessed so much of their story unfold across the changing seasons. And as the new dawn finally broke over Thornwood Castle, painting the snow-covered mountains in soft shades of gold, King Ronan Blackthorn stood beside his Luna, no longer the silent, feared ruler the castle had once known, but a man finally, fully alive again, ready to face whatever future awaited them both, together, exactly as it always should have been.